I will tell you when it is live.
Go.
As far as minutes, it looks like they weren't in the packet, so let's not do that. They were from 2/18, but I don't know, they're not in your board pack, so you do not have them, but they're in draft form somewhere here.
Get ready. Come on. And we are live.
Hi, we are calling to order the May 4th Public Services Committee meeting of Dublin, Ohio. Ann, will you please call roll?
Yes, Ms. Fox,
Here.
Vice Mayor DeRosa,
Here.
Come on.
and Mr. Reiner.
Here.
Today on the agenda, we're going to be discussing mobility and the share service that's available to the city. We will have a presentation from J.M. Rayburn. Jan, would you like to start that?
Great, so I'm going to get us kicked off here and introduce this, and then Chris Bongiorno with Nelson Nygaard and JM are then going to lead you through the majority of the presentation, but I just wanted to give a quick intro about what we're going to cover and what we hope to get from the committee in terms of feedback and next steps. So our outline today is really just to give a brief background to the mobility study in general, then dive into phase 3, which is the current phase that we're ending, just to give background and what the details of that are so you can understand this pilot program and what all the data that goes with that. Then talk through our funding and grants, and then ultimately, how the program could be sustained moving forward, which leads into that phase 4, which is next steps and how council and the committee potentially want to transition from the pilot program to a permanent program, and then obviously allowing feedback and discussion from the group as we go through the presentation, and then specifically at the end to make sure we get your feedback. So as council is aware, the mobility study was part of a bigger strategic plan looking at how to be innovative in our transportation network and improvements to that to help support our community in the various ways that we need for mobility, whether it's seniors and disabled or our workforce. So we're really looking at the holistic piece of this from a mobility standpoint. And then in terms of phases, as I mentioned, so the first 2 phases were in 2017, 2018, which were really sort of setting the vision, getting the public input for this piece, how to formulate that, looking at what our strategic priority areas are, and how to potentially implement that. And so then 2019 began the implementation of these pilot programs and looking at grant funding, sponsorship, how could we launch this type of mobility project. And again, we'll dive into the details of that and share with you all of our knowledge and things we've gained from that, which then leads us into phase 4 and assessing the pilots with your feedback and input, and then looking at how and if to transition to a permanent mobility program, and then how that funding would work. So with that, I'm going to kick it off to Chris, who's going to go into the background piece of this and then into the next steps. Okay.
Thanks, Jenny. And thanks for having me on the call. A little bit more detail on the 3 phases that we've completed in the Dublin Mobility Study or Dublin Mobility Plan. With council's leadership, they identified the need for enhanced multimodal transportation options in order to support the city's vision of being a vibrant, innovative, and engaged community. And with that, and Nelson Nygaard supported a vision setting workshop in February 2017 with an aim of defining a shared transportation vision to guide policy design and implementation strategies for multimodal improvements throughout Dublin. And the vision that came out of that workshop was to be a city of strong, growing, prosperous, and inclusive communities, supported by excellent mobility options that bolster a thriving economy, accommodate new and established populations, facilitate healthier lifestyles, encourage social connection, and allow for all Dubliners to fulfill their potential. Some underlying objectives that tie to that vision: support economic development, promote equitable access to mobility, expand multimodal options, improve public health, and preserve our environs by focusing on future growth. So that was the keys in phase one. Phase two really focused on moving into priorities and action plan development and queuing up those priorities for implementation around the city's connected community theme. So the 5 strategic priorities that came out were: 1, shuttles and circulators, and we're going to call that also microtransit; 2, bike share, which is part of a shared micromobility network; 3 is wayfinding; 4, concepts for mobility hubs; and 5, complete and smart streets. So moving from phase 2 to phase 3, starting in the fall of 2018, there was really a focus on those first 2, the shuttles and circulators or microtransit, and bike share, the shared micromobility network. And the bike share pilot, as you know, was operating in 2018 and really ended by the end of 2018, which is really right when the microtransit pilots were getting started. So the 2 priority areas for the microtransit program were to focus on: 1, the senior and people with disabilities market, and 2, the workforce market. So filling gaps in services to those 2 groups. The city went through a solicitation process in the fall of 2018 and contracted with Share to begin the pilot, in particular the senior and disabled shuttle, in January of 2019. And just a quick summary that the services proved very valuable to everybody who's using those services throughout the year. So we're going to drill down now on the senior and disabled shuttle. So as I mentioned, that service, that pilot service, launched in January 2019 as a circulator with 3 fixed routes, meaning people could look at a schedule, look at a map, and know exactly where that vehicle was going to take them at what time. Throughout the year, as is the nature of a pilot, we, in partnership with Share, looked at modifications to the model to make it more efficient and serve riders better. So by October of 2019, a shift was made to a fully dynamic model, which has to do with pre-scheduling rides, individuals pre-scheduling rides, and rides going to more explicit destinations, improving efficiency while still serving the needs of the riders. So over the course of the pilot, there were about 5,400 rides to seniors and people with disabilities, improving mobility independence to reach local commercial, recreational, educational, and entertainment destinations. Again, these are not medical trips. They're other quality of life type trips. Some other highlights from the senior and disabled shuttle pilot. First, the vast majority of rides originated from Avondale. They did a fantastic job in coordinating rides for their seniors. And the top destinations, as you see in orange, were predominantly retail destinations. And toward the Q4 of 2019 is when the ridership really picked up and exceeded 600 rides per month, which is pretty good for the service. You can see in a map on the right some of the highest frequency locations. I believe that was included in the memo if you want to look at it in more detail. So on to, and just a quick summary of that first pilot. Again, 5,400 rides, over 2,700 hours of service. The total cost came out to just over $160,000. And then again, that's including a total of 13 months of service. And the pilot, as you see in that, the green bars are the ridership per month increasing, and the blue dotted line is the cost per ride decreasing and leveling out under $30 per ride in January of 2020 at $25 per ride. So positive trends there, both with ridership growing and cost per ride declining.
Chris, do we know how many unique riders? So these are trips, right, basically, or so would that be a round trip, or every time somebody's off or on, did we do, you know what I'm?
Right. So every time somebody gets on the vehicle and goes to a destination, that is one trip. If they get the service back, that is another ride. So because sometimes people will use it to get to their destination and then we'll find another way back.
Do we know how many riders, unique riders, do we have that ability?
I do not have that at my fingertips, I'm sorry. There are a lot of people that used it.
Do we have that data?
It's in the data. We have all the raw data that we could pull. Now we ask for anonymized data. So I don't know if what I have at my fingertips, I'd be able to identify unique riders, but if it's something you want us to drill down on, we can try to find if we have that.
So this is my question, is over the course of time, are we getting different and new riders, or are we not? So are the same riders riding it more often, or are we getting new ridership? I guess that's sort of my question, and particularly, I guess, those that weren't from Avondale. So that's
Right.
sort of I'm not interested in who, obviously, but
Sure.
just sort
Yeah.
of an adoption rate on, who's using it, how many different residents are using it, that kind of thing. So I do think that would be an important consideration moving forward.
And I can just tell you from looking at the data toward the end of the pilot that, yes, there were a lot of riders who used the service regularly, which is great. But then as the service expanded in October to serve seniors aging in place, so not necessarily focused on the senior communities and Avondale in particular, there were a number of riders now that were distributed around the city that were coming from their home location. So a single family or a condominium that were not able to use the service during the first part of the year. So we did see some more diversification.
Yeah, I guess since this is a pilot and a learning phase, some more granularity of that data, I think, would be helpful for us as we think about moving forward. Thanks.
Okay. Yep.
Hey, Chris, I got a question for you. Avondale was one of the big commutes out of there, and we have so many different senior centers here. Was there numbers roughly on the other senior centers?
We have the numbers. They were all pretty low, though. So when this pilot started, there was a lot of outreach from SHARE. That one of their staff people really went out into the communities and cultivated relationships. And I don't know how many of you were at the big kickoff event in mid-January of 2019, but it was very well attended and a lot of people were very interested and excited about it. But I think what ended up happening with Avondale was that they had a very active and engaged resident coordinator who took a key role in booking these trips and making sure seniors were using it. Now, Nelson Nygaard's role was not in the kind of on the ground engagement and marketing. So that is probably a better question for SHARE to answer in terms of where maybe in the other communities more effort could be undertaken or a more successful engagement with those communities to generate more ridership.
No, I think that's a good point. I think from just listening to what you said about Avondale at first, I was just thinking, yeah, they probably got somebody that's really working that and getting the people lined up for mobility, and the other places might not be as aggressive. And I think that's the whole difference, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I don't know if the phase 3 report has been circulated to everyone, but that was certainly one of the things we called out was, generating more relationships on the senior side in particular with those senior communities. And then when we get to the workforce side, obviously with employers.
Chris, and committee members, since we have such a short time today and quite a bit to go through, let's let Chris finish his presentation. Save your questions till he finishes. We'll ask him then before we go on to the next presenter. I think it might make it more efficient meeting. Appreciate that.
Thanks. And we do have a pause scheduled at the end of this section. So moving on to the second service, the workforce pilot, there was an original contract with a service provider that was never finalized. They ended up pulling out of the market, both regionally and nationally. So when we looked at that service launching, we kind of consciously put it on hold while the senior service got up and running, and then re-engaged with Share for a March 2019 launch. So it started a little bit later. The focus was on last mile, first mile service to and from CODA stops. So everybody knows that the CODA services don't really run a thorough network or at great frequencies throughout Dublin, but you can get to Dublin. So these services really are picking up from those CODA stops and continuing the last mile of the trip to workforce destinations. The overall goal of this mobility program is to shift 1% of the workforce trips to shared mobility as a mode of choice. Also to promote mobility as a workplace benefit, something that employers can start to promote to existing employees and potential hires, help make Dublin a stronger workplace. And then just a quick sum, about 1,700 rides provided over the course of the pilot. So for the workforce pilot, the numbers again were down considerably versus the senior and disabled shuttle. Some solid relationships were developed with AC Marriott and Bridge Park, as well as Friendship Village and Stanley Steamer, who promoted this to their employees. Transfers from CODA's Route 21 at Tuttle Mall were the most popular. Through testimonials from users of the service, they were finding that the service provided a time savings of about a half an hour, shaving off of their everyday commute, as well as a significant cost savings for people who, in many cases, were using Uber and Lyft to fill those first and last mile gaps, or to replace CODA service altogether, which can be very expensive. To sum the workforce shuttle, again, just about 1,700 rides over the course of the pilot, 1,254 hours of service, an operating cost of just under $80,000. And that number of cost per ride is not as good as the senior service. And part of that is that the service was slow to be adopted, both by employers and employees. Still a lot of room for improvement there. The operating model is also a little bit different. With the senior model, at least 2 passengers are required to pre-book a trip in order for the trip to actually take place. Whereas on the workforce shuttle, if one rider books a trip at least 24 hours in advance, that shuttle will make the trip. So there's some inherent inefficiencies with the system, but it was really viewed as an essential service for those workers who are using it. There's a few testimonials here coming from, first, this Avondale Senior Program and Care Coordinator. I'm not going to read them. And the other 2 are from regular riders on the workforce shuttle. Just, great evidence of the value of these services to the community. And I believe there's one more slide for me. So again, key findings in our phase 3 report, that the demand for new mobility service exists. That's not just the microtransit pilot, but other mobility priorities that were identified. That there are still gaps in Dublin's mobility network, both with the microtransit program, geographies unserved, times of day that aren't able to be served, and so on, folks who aren't able to access the service. That the service delivery requires a lot of cross-sector collaboration, and some of it exists. Avondale Partnership is one prime example, but more of that is needed. The City of Dublin's leadership is really paramount in getting the system and the service launched and sustaining it. So kudos to the city for really taking the leadership position there. And then the concern with program sustainability, and that's really going to feed into JM's section next.
Great, thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Chris. Committee members, now's a good opportunity for questions for Chris. Any further questions?
I'll save them until we get to the end. Thanks.
Yeah, me
Okay.
too.
I just have one question for you, Chris. When it comes to the Share shuttle service, they have to reserve how far in advance, and must they use an app to do so for the seniors?
So 24 hours in advance.
Okay.
And the app is the preferred method, but as you might suspect, not everybody wants to download an app or has a phone that enables them to download an app. So in particular at Avondale, where we know that the vast majority of that senior ridership was coming from, the coordinator was able to set up a lot of the booking. Phone-in reservations were also enabled. So, that's part of the evolution of the pilot, that Share really wanted to make it accessible to the target audience. And not everybody was going to be willing or able to use an app. So they made that flexible. But the dynamic scheduling does work most efficiently if that app is used.
And last question on the share service, they're only taken to places like restaurants, grocery stores, shopping centers, no other places, like not to a doctor's office, not to another resident's home, not
Right.
to.
So, yeah, and that was an evolving conversation throughout the year. The objective was not to provide, healthcare visits, but they did want to connect to, like, the Dublin Recreation Center was a very popular destination. The food pantry was a popular destination, the library. But we also acknowledged throughout the course of the pilot that some social visits to health facilities, and whether a senior was visiting a friend or a loved one or volunteering, those were allowed. Those trips were allowed. It was just not meant to serve trips that could otherwise be provided by an existing service that would maybe be funded through a Medicare, Medicaid program.
Okay, and then the workforce shuttle. Does the shuttle have to be reserved as well to pick them up at the bus stop? And how much time is required in reserving that?
Same rule. So 24 hours in advance. And in the case of most of the riders that became regular riders, they would book several weeks at a time. It wasn't a process of going through one day at a time. They could say, I want to book, a 7:30 a.m. pickup from this bus stop to this workplace, and just say, I'm going to do that every day for 4 weeks.
Okay.
So it was meant to be an efficient process in that way.
Right. And I, like Kathy and John, am interested in the data that's collected on this. And secondly, understanding how often the van sits, I don't know how many vans there are, but how often they sit unused, the time that they sit unused.
Right.
They're not actually driving anyone anywhere. That's important too.
And my understanding, and we can double check on this, is that the operating hours were the hours that the vehicle was making a trip. So the way it was programmed was not to have it sitting idle. If it's sitting idle and it's not, in preparation for the next trip, it shouldn't be counted as an operating hour. But we can double check on that. The other thing about the efficiency was during the first 6 months or so of the senior pilot, it was running trips regardless of, there was no pre-booking essentially.
Right.
So you could have a vehicle with nobody on it or 2 people on it. So as the pilot evolved, they wanted to make sure that the trip was only being made if there was a passenger on it, and that's where the pre-booking came in.
Right. And I get the fact that there's that it's not counted as a deliverable hour, but I think it's important to know on the course of a day how many hours of the day is actually being utilized and how many hours of the day are not being utilized. In other words, it gives you potential for what else could be used.
Right, and the 2 pilots together provide some efficiency there as well, because you have most of the workforce commutes are happening during the AM and PM peak. And again, that's not a huge volume, unfortunately, at this point. And then the senior and disabled rides were happening in between those peaks.
Okay.
So you're able to use the same vehicles and, not duplicate in that way.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
The information Jane is asking for, I think, is very important. The downtime of these. And I need a clarification, Chris. So if you're going to go to Walmart's or if you're going to go to a restaurant, when you book this, you book it, you tell them, pick me up at 8 and then pick me back up at 10. Is that how it really works?
So that would be booking 2 separate trips, yes.
Yes, but you would book it that way. So the route, yeah, okay, got you. All right, thanks.
Anyone else? And I'm staying on the line, so.
All right, great. We're ready for the next presenter.
Hello, this is J.M. Rayburn, and I will be touching quickly on how microtransit has, let me go back, I'm sorry. How microtransit has played a role during the pandemic response from the city. And then after that, I'm going to dive into more of the funding, grants, and program sustainability. So hold on tight. With respect to Dublin Cares and the COVID-19 pandemic, it's worth noting that we did have a sharp drop in our ridership beginning in mid-March with a lot of the shelter-at-home order. This was a challenge for our service because we didn't want to expose some of the most vulnerable members of our community to potential exposure to the pandemic. So we really had to think about how we can change the service and still serve the community. And that's what led to a delivery service that was operated by Share and deployed for the community. And the intent of this service was to provide food, face masks, and other essential goods from our community partners to residents at different facilities and different pickup points. So really want to extend our thank you to Share and our partners for helping us achieve this feat and being so flexible with the service at the same time. So it's worth noting before we move on.
Hey, Jan.
Oh, yes, I'm
Jan,
sorry.
Can you tell us how many runs were made during this whole March 15th? That's really a great program to try to get food to people that can't get out and pick it up. I'm just curious how many people really access that availability and use this.
I can give you the exact numbers, but roughly speaking, each delivery held between 15 to 40 units of either food or essential goods or masks. And that some of these runs, or excuse me, some of the deliveries were scheduled on a weekly basis, and some of them were scheduled, as the need came up. So I can get you a better idea of what those numbers are, but I just want to give you an idea of what it looked like.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, JM, it's Kathy. I know that CODA's not running the expresses, and but they are going to start picking up service again as people are going back to work. The 21, I still think, keeps running. Is the workforce shuttle still running?
There are some essential employees that are still using the service.
Okay.
So we've had a handful of those that we're still able to provide service to. Some of these workers, I'm thinking off the top of my head, I believe one is for a senior care facility and others may be more retail oriented to provide those essential goods to our community.
Okay, so we're still doing what we can there. If somebody requests it and they're essential.
Exactly. It's not a very high number at this time, but we are providing that service.
Great, thanks.
And Kathy, there have been additional inquiries during the pandemic with folks who are considering getting to work. So people know it's out there, and Share has stayed available to meet those requests.
And as you know,
Can,
CODA.
can you
as they've
identify
been
yourself?
Oh, it's
Can you
Kathy.
identify as who's responding? I mean, the
Um,
responder before you.
I'm sorry, that was Chris Bongiorno, Nelson Nygaard.
Okay, thank you.
Chris, I know CODA, a large shift in responsiveness and able to move away from fixed route to some on-demand stuff. And as we move forward, I think the ability for us to help in some of these on-demand things is going to be particularly interesting. And as CODA's collecting data, I'm hopefully we'll be able to share that kind of data back and forth, because I think all the communities around are going to be very interested in, some of these details, hence my request for that about, who's adopting and who isn't and why they're using it and why they're not, those types of things, because I think we're going to see some interesting shifts in that. So thank you.
Great. So we'll move on to funding and grants and program sustainability. I do want to give a heads up that this may get a little overwhelming, so I will try to do my best to lay out all the information for you all in preparation for a good discussion. We'll start with the CIP funds. Mobility Initiatives was approved for $250,000 a year. And at the same time, in the 2020 to 2024 CIP, $220,000 was approved for bike share implementation. From the CIP funds, we looked as staff for other opportunities for funding resources outside the city. And we started with grants. Thankfully, our partners at Morpsey and CODA were able to partner with us on a lot of these initiatives. The first one that I want to call out is the FTA Section 5310 program. That is from the Federal Transit Administration, and this is geared towards people who are older adults and individuals with disabilities and how to enhance mobility for them. So our Senior Disabled Shuttle was a great fit for that program, and we were awarded $62,500 in 2019 as part of our pilot year. We submitted for 5310 funding again in 2020, and we are awarded $50,000 for this budget year. So we'll jump to that later. I do want to mention that we were able to partner with CODA on an opportunity through the Ohio Department of Transportation, and this program was called the Ohio Transit Partnership Program, or OTP2 for short. We worked with CODA on this application, and through CODA's collaboration, we're able to secure $250,000 to go towards workforce shuttle services. So that's a big deal, and the life of that grant is from the summer of 2019, and it goes till May of 2020. So we're working with CODA and ODOT, given the circumstances, to extend that grant to the end of the year, which would be great for our workforce shuttle. When we think about where the money is being used as part of mobility initiatives, 67% of our costs in microtransit last year went towards supporting the Senior Disabled Shuttle. 33% of our costs went towards the workforce shuttle. As we look at how those costs compared to the grants that we were able to secure, and at the end of the day, we were able to have about 39% of the Senior Disabled Shuttle, the cost covered through the 5310 grant program. And we're able to get 81% of the workforce shuttle paid for as well. And really the costs that weren't covered were those costs that were accrued before May of 2019. So that at the very end, when we combine all of the grants, we were able to cover just over 50% of the program cost through external grant funding. When we look at the whole budget altogether, this is looking at what were the final costs after the grants were applied. So while the city did commit $250,000 in the CIP, we were able to use grants, and the actual cost to the city at the end of the program was $107,000 and some change. It is worth noting, through private sponsorships, we were able to secure a sponsorship through Casto for the Senior Disabled Shuttle last year, as well as the Dublin Entrepreneurial Center provided some sponsorship money to run a special lunchtime shuttle for the workforce to take advantage of food trucks and some other lunchtime amenities. As we look to 2020, program sustainability is a top priority for staff. When we look at the funds remaining for 2020, we have expended a good amount of that money, and that's to cover the first 6 months of the share services in microtransit. There was an ordinance 10-20, which was recently approved, and that was funds that were taken to redirect the reimbursement of the grants. It's really important to understand that as we win these grants and we submit for reimbursement, that money goes back into the general fund of the city. And so really what this ordinance was achieving was to bring that money back to mobility programs so we can continue to work on sustainability of the program overall. As I mentioned before, the grants, we were able to secure the 5310 program grant for 2020 at the amount of $50,000. And we do have $185,000 left out of the $250,000 that was awarded as part of the OTP2 grant with CODA. And as I mentioned, we are working with CODA and ODOT to get those funds to be used until the end of 2020 to support the workforce shuttle for the whole year. As we begin to add up the different revenue sources of funding, we start with the 53,000. The ordinance was able to replenish that grant money that was awarded to the city. We do have the 5310 grant for this year that we'll be able to use around summertime. And part of what you might have saw in the memo was thinking about if we can transfer some of the bike share money over to microtransit. And that's important because given the circumstances of COVID-19 and our strategy as staff, we want to look at implementing bike share, COGO in particular, with other communities in the region. And so we're looking at a different strategy in order to go for more attributable funds in order to pay for a bulk of that COGO expansion. So that's on hold for 2020, and that money isn't likely to be used this year. So it's worth noting that as we think about program sustainability moving forward. I'd like to give a quick snapshot on how other communities in Central Ohio are approaching microtransit and how they're using the service for their communities. We do have Dublin as using Share, and all the other communities seem to have been using Coda Plus or other means such as Smart Ride for New Albany and Great as part of the Rickenbacker effort with Groveport and Obetz. Hilliard is expected to have Coda Plus, but we don't have that information. It's not publicly available at the moment, but it's worth looking at this chart to understand what other communities are doing, how long their service duration is, and then their base fare is worth addressing as well. We provide this service in Dublin at no cost to the resident or workforce. There is a base fare for Coda Plus, but it is worth noting that that fare is waived if you are transferring to or from a Coda fixed route service. And that's the vast majority of the users that use it, or the riders that use it. We do have a column to look at the total cost and the commitment from municipality. And that's really to give you an idea of what other communities are investing in microtransit and how they're doing it and at what levels. As we talk about the next steps and opportunities for microtransit in phase 4, it's worth noting that we need some more time to engage with our partners, Coda and Share and maybe other microtransit providers, and work with them to get more, let me take a step back. Right now, the contract is going to expire with Share in June 2020. And given the COVID pandemic, that's really thrown off the capability and capacity for Share and Coda and other operators to provide a response to us if we were to publish a request for proposals. And so what we would like to look at is extending the contract to the end of the year. And that's an effort to give Coda and Share and other providers an opportunity to provide a proposal for us, because right now they don't have the capacity to do so. Something else to look at is based on the outcomes of phase 3, we're looking with our program partners to pursue a series of opportunities to help with microtransit as it evolves, as Chris has mentioned. So we're looking at balancing resources, expanding our partnership, and continuing to look at other policies to help bolster the effectiveness of microtransit in our community. So that concludes the presentation. What we'd like to now ask is for feedback from the committee on 5 different areas. So one would be looking at the strategic priority areas that were mentioned from previous phases. We want to talk about that. And we also want to talk about, we want to get some feedback on how we want to look to subsidizing this program and sustainability of the program overall. Then we want to look at the Share's contract, and then looking at more feedback on the RFP, and finally talking about funding and consolidating some existing sources. So I'll end it there, and I'll open it up to the committee to respond. Thank you.
Okay, this is a great opportunity for questions. I know I have a few. It really, to me, my biggest questions surround data. It's really, I think we can see where some of the gaps are, but I don't think we understand exactly what those gaps look like. So for instance, we didn't talk about the bike share, but not really understanding where, and I know this isn't in the rider of the workforce shuttle, but I'm not exactly sure why the bike share failed. So that's data that I'd like to know. And also, I think Kathy and John made a point too about the riders. Are we meeting the methodology in evaluating whether or not we're hitting our objectives? The objectives being a broad use of the service. Are we serving simply a small segment of people, the same people over and over, and maybe one senior living community, and not serving others? So are we just getting a small handful of people always riding the same one? I'd like to also know how flexible the share shuttle is for other riders. In other words, if we had the data to know how often it's sat not moving, could we get better efficiencies in opening it up to more than just seniors? Is there, and is that easily gotten data, JM? Or anyone?
Yeah, that's something that we can certainly look to get. It is worth noting real quick, when we look at other microtransit services in the region, Share is using scheduling ahead of time in order to get the most efficiency out of their route planning. When you look at Coda Plus, they do provide microtransit, but it's not scheduled ahead of time. It's more of on demand. And so there's a different strategy for how many vehicles you leave on demand versus scheduling ahead of time. So my point would be there's still more efficiency than having maybe a Coda Plus, where it's all on demand. You need to have more vehicles readily available to pick up people who do schedule them in real time. So it's something to think about as we look at different types of microtransit inefficiencies. I think there probably is more efficiency to be gained with Share, but I think when you look at their strategy for scheduling rides, there is inherent efficiency there. Okay.
Do you happen to know in New Albany how the Smart Ride operates? Because I noticed that its cost was $120,000. I'm not sure. I know it's a small shuttle. Do you know how that works? How New Albany Smart Ride works by any chance?
So this is Chris again. My understanding of that service is that it does provide a healthy number of rides. It's been on the ground for several years though, so it has had time to generate ridership and adoption. It really focuses primarily on the workforce commutes. It operates during a fixed period of time. It is not a pre-booked service. So I think the cost does look very low. It's more than you spent on the workforce service last year, but it operated for the full year. I'm just looking at some of the numbers I have that, it did provide, it regularly provides between 20,000 and 30,000 rides per year on that budget of $120,000, which equates to a very low operating cost per ride. Actually, it's remarkably low compared even to the Groveport service, which costs not quite, maybe about 4 times as much with a similar ridership. So we can look into what the difference is between those two services, why one is operating much more efficiently than the other.
Right. Yeah. I just think that we're thinking about strategic priorities. To me, one of the strategic priorities is starting to analyze the data of what is working here, what isn't working, because the cost of $45 for the workforce shuttle one way and $45 back, especially the people that are riding it, is, and if they're making a minimum wage, is substantially what they make in a day's worth of work. So I think we really do need to look at, we have a lot of data to analyze. So I'll stop there and let others ask questions.
Great. I had a couple questions. Chris, or first of all, how does share get paid? Is it a fixed amount or are we paying them cost per ride? I don't recall that.
They book the hours and they bill monthly. I'm sorry, I should have let JM respond.
No, so we're paying them only when in use. It's a variable cost.
Correct.
Mhm. So we know that there's a fixed cost amount here that, you know, one ride or 700 rides or whatever, you've got one vehicle fully dedicated or not. So I again, sort of back to data, I think it's going to be important for us to understand what would be a minimum overall fixed cost to do a service, whether there was, you know, 10 people or 100 people, and where are those step functions? So I guess what I'm saying is, if for a certain level of service in the city of Dublin, there's going to be a set of fixed costs. What is that? And we weren't going to go below that. And then we add more riders and the cost per rider goes down, but the total cost stays the same. So the share model is a variable one. I don't think some of the other ones are necessarily variables. I think they're more, I'm committing to paying you a minimum of X amount of dollars or something. So I think from a cost sustainability, we're going to have to understand that because I think that's really incredibly relevant here. And that's when you talk about efficiency. Until you get to a certain amount, you're not going to get there, but that's important. The other question that I would pose potentially is extending this through the end of the year. We might wish to extend it to the end of the following year even. And I guess the reason I say that or leave it as a longer, because clearly the social distancing and the requirements of who's going to ride this, until we start to see that pick up again, and we don't know if that's going to be June, July, August, September, we're going to have very low numbers here, right? And so we may not use that money, don't want to lose that money. We want to think about that. And when do we beef back up again on some of this? So, you know, when are people going to feel good about, as a senior, taking public transportation with a shared ride, right? And with social distancing, you're only going to be able to put 2 people on that bus at a time anyway, probably most of those buses. You know, CODA's limiting their great big buses to 20 riders, right? That's what's happening there. So I just think, I think absolutely we should extend that. I just think thinking through the timing of this and the restart and the money, just the realities of the world we're living in right now, I think are going to be pretty important to how you do that. And my final comment is, you know, CODA's had enormous success with CODA Plus, the CPAS, excuse me, where the employers are helping fund some of that cost per ride, right? We know that that has been an enormous success. And so if we look at I guess it was the Stanley Steamer and the Marriott and some of these, a CPAS model where, you know, there's some funding going to support some of this because the idea of transportation as a benefit, particularly for lower income employees, is hugely important. And we absolutely should be all over that as we go through this and should figure this out. Clearly the economics right now are hurting businesses, but the CPAS model, because they're going to need these workers when they open the doors again. So that's going to be important. So those are some of my thoughts about funding and data and sort of timing on the.
Yeah, so this is John. I'm just sort of curious about, you sounds like you did a really good job with the outside funding. I guess my question is, what are the possibilities of that continuing in both of these regards? The different kinds of shuttles. Is that something that's very possible that we're going to get those kind of funds every year, or is that going to sort of wane away in the future?
I don't, excuse me, this is JM speaking. Those funds are hopefully going to be around in the future, but the issue is that we're competing with other entities that also have a need for the funding. And what it comes down to is we can make a great case, but we may not get as much money consistently every single year if we're competing with different needs in the community. So that being said, we are looking at other opportunities for external funding. AARP has an opportunity that we're going to be applying to this year, and that is to help support the senior disabled shuttle services. And that will be on top of what we already have won with the 5310 this year. The hope is with the grant money for the workforce, it looks promising that we can get that money to be used to the end of 2020. We still need official word on that. But if we continue, to Chris's point earlier, to leverage partnerships and grow partnerships, that will help with other funding and other support in the future.
You know, and like my colleagues, I'm sort of curious about what's really going on with the, the COVID situation now. We've been a month and a half into it, and then the projections for the future. I'm sure that's greatly impacting who's riding on these buses and in these vehicles. So, and again, agree with them on the data. We need a lot more data to make a really firm judgment on this, to see where we're going. But, it sounds like it's been used. And one thing that's occurred to me that, Avondale probably has more of a concierge type of person handling this thing. And, probably the rest of them might have people changing out, sitting at that desk. And so a lot of the marketing or help that goes into promoting this kind of program, which is really beneficial to our seniors and the handicapped, probably really isn't getting out there. So that's another whole thing to look at here in a later date.
I will say it's worth noting with Avondale's case that they don't have access to fixed route CODA services, and they're more than a mile outside of fixed route service. And that mile radius is important because that's when you're able to use the mainstream ADA service for CODA. So they don't have any regular CODA service. They don't have access to mainstream CODA service. So I think when we think about moving forward, it's important to make note of what is the overall connectivity for some of these communities.
I agree with you, JM. I think one of the things that I'd like to make sure that we're clear on is if we say that we're going to extend the contract at this point, if we don't extend the contract on the workforce shuttle, it's possible that we'll give up almost $81,000 in grant money. Is that correct? We've
spent 81,000 of the 250, so we do have 170, available. So
and that, because we're doing both shuttles that are sharing the burden of that, because we're combining this money actually supports both on this, on a daily basis. If we didn't continue the workforce shuttle, we would be giving up that 181 that would help support, as a consequence, the senior shuttle as well, correct?
Correct. Something to note though is with currently the contract, we have a bank of hours. So for 6 months, we have 2,300 hours to use between both services. Usually what plays out is the senior disabled takes about 2/3 of those hours up, or that money. If we can continue to work with CODA and ODOT, there could be opportunity to go for another OTP2 grant. Something to think about too is if we do change providers with, let's say, CODA Plus, CODA Plus can advocate on our behalf to get more of that ODOT money for workforce. However, we may not be eligible to go for the 5310 funds anymore.
I see.
Or if we do a hybrid, we could look at that, but we don't. That would be something that we'd have to look more into.
Right.
Okay.
Let's go through these questions for the feedback, and let's have each of our committee members on number one, input on regarding the strategic priority areas. Kathy, would you like to start what you think the strategic priority areas are? Kathy, you're muted still.
I'm trying to go back to those.
Okay.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I don't know what I was doing there. Okay, these are the strategic areas. Okay. I'm after we had a pretty tough go of the first bike share, as did many other communities. I don't know that I would raise that to the top level at this point until we see some things happening. And again, sort of a timing on with the reality we're living here. Are people going to want to share bikes? I don't know. So if you're asking for priorities, I think the shuttle and the circulator are priorities. I would love to see some hard thinking about the timing of when to start and when to move this so that we can maximize those funds. And I know we've used some of that and appropriately and rightly so on delivery of goods and services for people. So, how do we balance all of that, but from a priority area? I think the mobility hubs concept is very interesting. And I think it will change the use and dynamics and increase the use of rider. Folks are not really used to taking and riding the bus of any sort. That's just not sort of, as of Dublinites, that's not something we've done a lot. But as I read through the materials on the mobility hubs, I think there's some really interesting things we couldn't do there. So I would prioritize probably 1 and 4 on that. And in the mobility hubs, I'd make darn sure they were smart hubs and really put technology in those hubs. So that sort of takes the smart streets a little bit, but that's my thinking. Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I didn't realize that in looking at this, we hadn't even discussed the mobility hubs yet. So we'll have an opportunity, I think, to do that still in the presentation. But I guess I wanted to get some input on the priorities of the shuttle and circulator first and foremost, since it was at the end of that presentation. John, your thoughts on the shuttle and circulator?
Yeah, I think, again, we probably want to be focused on seniors and the handicapped. I think linking, we have a lot of senior homes here, and linking them somehow or getting them up to an awareness where they can be more effective would be really important. The hub concept, I think is probably a great idea. I'm back into the bicycle thing because I have used those. I know Greg said he finally got a chance to use them, and I sort of like them. But the thing I didn't like, some of the other ones that I've seen being utilized over the city of Columbus, Lime, just the idea of throwing the bikes down. I like the concept of grouping the bikes in an orderly way so you can get around, get from work to downtown to the dining areas and other places. So if we were to investigate that, I'd like to see that set up in such a way that they're not littered all over the community. And so and then we get back to the COVID thing on, do you want to pick up a bike? And we don't know, I guess, and Kathy just mentioned it, the ramifications of picking up somebody else's bike and taking off with it until we figure this thing out. But I still think, it's a wonderful, especially for our younger people who are down at Bridge Street and working at Cardinal and these other places. I still think that's something that's, has a lot of appeal to me. So I'm still very interested in it.
Thanks,
Thank
John. So on my part, I think most important strategically, data, and more data to understand how we can better utilize these shuttles, who's using them, who's not using them, how we could use them more flexibly. And once we know that, we might be able to develop more interest with funding partners. So if we find that it's just the hotels that are using them, and we might be able to go to other businesses, like when OSU comes in, or why isn't the hospital using them? Why isn't Ohio Health folks using them? So maybe we could discover more possibilities for their use. I'm with everyone else. I think during the virus and the pandemic, bike share is important, but probably not within the next 6 to 12 months. But wayfinding, I think, is important because now everybody here in Dublin is walking the bike paths, using their bikes. I know I'm not normally a biker, but if I were to go out, I would get lost because I don't know where these bike paths lead. And I don't know if I'd make it home in any efficient manner. So wayfinding, I think, is something that we do have time to do. The mobility hubs, I think, are important, but I think that that's something within the next few years we should really be concentrating on. I agree. I go through the city and I see these wonderful places people are sitting and waiting for buses. But I think that goes along hand in hand with partners with CODA to find out how we can increase public transit. I think if you ask most people, they tell you they don't even know if a bus runs in Dublin. So we have a lot of awareness to increase. And one other strategic priority on the shuttles, I went to our website to go under share. I looked at the New Albany's, Grove Cities, kind of looked to see how they advertised and marketed. And ours is a little outdated. It was last updated January of 2018. And it isn't like a point by point on how you get around in Dublin. It's more informational about the whole program. I think it would behoove us to collect a little marketing info from other communities. Like Grove City says, number one, you can get from here to there by doing this. And number two, this is available to you. You can hop on a CODA from a CODA Plus, and you can go anywhere within this purple area, and it shows it right on the map. I mean, it's very easy to use. You don't have to worry about it. And third, I think when it comes to the elderly, apps are not their most favorite way of doing anything. So if they require someone else to reserve a ride for them, we're already in trouble, I think, because they should be able to easily be able to figure out how to reserve their own ride. So ease of use is another strategic priority, I think.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
Okay, so let's go back. Do we have some presentations for mobility hubs, wayfinding that we need to get to?
Councilmember Fox, we focused mostly on microtransit for this meeting because it was such a large amount of information. If it's okay with the committee, we'd like to come back and maybe we can tackle other strategic priority areas, excuse me, or we can do them individually as you please.
Okay, great. That's good to know. So you want to take us back to your feedback page and we'll answer number 2.
I'm sorry, I'm looking for the cheat to just put the thing in, but I can't find it. I apologize.
Okay.
I'm just gonna click through it. Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, so this one is, the question is feedback on subsidizing and sustainability of microtransit services. Kathy, you want to give your comment there?
You know what? I believe the senior circulator concept is important. I would absolutely prioritize workforce, and that could be workforce movement within and across the city, you know, during midday as well as pickup. I know and have been, you know, working on getting more service to and from Dublin, because frequency is the thing that has to happen. If there is not frequency, people cannot rely on it, and everyone knows that. We're in a very strange period right now. So for the next few months, this is going to be challenging. But if we look past that next few months, I would absolutely prioritize workforce and that, because I think that's going to be essential as we move forward. And we have a lot of data coming from other municipalities right now. The Westerville one, they've started, right? So we're going to have some good data we can learn from our colleagues in some of these. So yeah, you've heard data a lot of times. So I think we've got to understand the data a little bit more. I think one of the challenges of getting repeat grants from the state is there's a lot of people, as you mentioned, JR, raising their hand for some of those grants. And I don't know what the likelihood is Dublin would get it next year, the year after. We might see those go to other municipalities, you know, just in reality. So I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge. Again, I go back to CPAS and getting the employers involved in some of these others because it is a benefit. Transportation is a benefit. A lot of employers are paying people subsidies for their parking garages, right? So there's a line item in there on the benefits section, and I think there's some dollars and cents there. But you know, finding a service, as Jane I think mentioned earlier, that's used by quite a few, so that we can really figure out how to leverage it, I think is going to be the secret to sustainability. Thanks.
John?
Yeah, I think, again, congratulations for the aggressiveness of the staff to seek out the kind of federal funding and other funding they got. And especially as it's regarding handicapped people and aged, I hope you keep chasing that. And I agree with what Kathy said. I think in time, some of that's going to trickle away from us and go to other municipalities that are just getting started in this. But I would like to keep an aggressive stance on that, because that's a lot of money that was brought in and really took a lot of the ouch out of this for the entire community. And I also think that, and I agree with Kathy and Jane both on this, that in the future, we're going to have to look at businesses and getting employees in and out of Dublin from remote areas is going to be important, and see if they're willing to subsidize this. And it's going to take, as you guys have stated, and we both, well, all three of us have said, the data is sort of the key to all this, to find out a little more detailing and from our neighbors. So that's how I feel about that. Thank you.
Okay, great. As far as I'm concerned, I definitely think that the city can participate in subsidizing. We need to make sure that we sustain microtransit services. There's no doubt about it. But my sense is, and we've said it already, that subsidizing is based on evidence that the data shows us that we're spending the money in a successful and an efficient manner, and we're growing the objectives in economic development, in public health, in access to many. I think that if we continue to subsidize, we have to do the methodology of evaluation. And that's where data comes in. There's no way you can tell if you're successful unless you can measure it with the data. So for me, I'm for continuing, but it has to be hand in hand with evidence of our success and our improvements or lack of. Okay.
Right.
All right. So number 3, they need feedback on the extension of Share's contract to December 31, 2020. Kathy, you want to start?
So I have a question. I guess this goes to JM. If we have the grants in place, moving this to 2020, in essence, if the demand finds its way back up, we're going to have lower demand for the next. I mean, that's just a fact for a little while. What would be the true cost to Dublin to do that between now and the end? I'm asking you to speculate a little bit, but.
Between the current contract, or if we would extend it to the end of the year?
The current if we move it to the end of the year.
The current contract is for 6 months with 2,300 hours of service, and that's being charged at $80 per hour of service. So that's how we got $184,000 for 6 months of this year. If we were to extend it to December 31st of this year, I would at least like to use the same terms, or if we can get a better rate, that's even better. But I don't, going for another 2,300 hours, we might want to revisit that, to be honest, just to your point of how the market has changed with demand. It's also important to note that while we do have $184,000 that was taken out to cover the first 6 months, we probably won't use all of those hours, and we only get billed for hours of service. So with that in mind, think about that as we continue to move forward. We may want to scale down that contract as well based on the hours that we're going to be seeing over the next couple months.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see that demand, and you can only put a couple people in that bus right now. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter until the rules change on social distancing. So while the workforce may only be one, the Avondale, when that changes and people start riding their seniors, those shared rides, right? You have some realities there. So I'm for it. I have no idea what this is going to cost us. Maybe you could bring that number back to us, but and sequencing it in a way that makes the most sense for the residents and the pilot. So I'm for it. You guys will have to figure out the best approach given the realities that we're living in.
So I would say that the tricky thing is with the grant money, we only get it in reimbursement. So we have to front the money first, which makes things a little tricky. But as long as that money is returned back to the mobility initiatives, it helps with the program sustainability overall. So that's something to keep in mind. With respect to the rest of the year, we did have the ordinance 10-20 was passed, and that's to take the grant money from last year and to put it back into the fund. So when you look at that money with the 53,000 that's currently in there and the 50,000 from the 5310 later this summer, we should be in good shape to extend to the end of the year. So we feel pretty confident in that request.
Okay, that makes sense. Your point of just being prudent about how you structure that, given the reality that we're living in right now, right? If we're not going to use those hours, we shouldn't contract probably for those hours, unless, back to your earlier point about deliveries and some other things, if there is some real social benefit to this, that would make sense in the program. But without seeing the dollars and cents here, I mean, you guys will have to know how to do that. But in essence, I say yes, and then, do what you guys know are the right way to make that happen.
Okay, John, would you like to?
With the current situation, of course, there's no way for us to guess what's really going to happen here and how fast this thing's going to end and how fast the workforce is going to continue, or come back. But do you have, of the $81,000, any idea what of that is going to be left and where we're going to be? I know this is a tough guess. It's like watching these medical guys on TV try to forecast this plague, you might say. Do you have any idea where we're at on that?
I can tell you before the COVID pandemic, we were averaging about 16,000 a month for the senior disabled shuttle and about 10,000 a month for the workforce shuttle. So I can tell you it's definitely underneath 10,000 a month. To your point, we'll just have to continue to monitor the next several weeks or months to see what a right amount will be moving forward.
Yeah, in the long term, I suggest we continue to 2020. But of course, it's all going to be based on the adjustments that none of us really can predict. So, and I guess hopefully the seniors who are shut in, instead of taking these rides, are going to somehow, as you alluded to earlier, there's a chance getting things delivered to them, which is really beneficial, I'm sure. So that's really a good change in the program.
Okay. Thanks, John. Could I ask you what's our flexibility within the program's parameters on utilizing the share shuttle for others besides seniors and workforce? Are we limited by anything? Any program parameters?
When it comes to the grant money, there are limitations, which is why we have to pull from a few different grants to fund the whole program. So for example,
the limitations for seniors are that, what are the limitations?
So for the 5310 funds, the grant limits us only using that money to enhance mobility for seniors and individuals with disabilities. We did confirm with MORPC that we can use the grant for delivery of essential goods and food and services for seniors and people with individuals with disabilities, excuse me.
Right.
With the workforce side, that the scope of that grant with ODOT, the Ohio Transit Partnership Program, that was specifically geared towards our workforce shuttle. And to Dublin's credit, we're able to make a good impression for that grant because we're seen as trailblazers and utilizing technology and other elements to deliver a new transportation service. So that was seen very favorable to the reviewers at ODOT. Moving forward, we'll see if more of the money will be focused on sustaining programs or if they want to look for more ways to innovate in transportation funding.
Okay, so one way that we save money is by, in other words, just having a circulator that isn't reserved, and like, let's say for instance at Metro Place, I remember that many of the people over there where they were working, of course no one's working in their office now, but wanted to hop a shuttle, go get a bite of lunch and be able to get back in time. So if we were to use a shuttle in a different way for the workforce, we're going to pay for every hour they're driving around picking people up, correct?
Correct. And to that point, for that particular situation, we can double check with CODA and ODOT to see what the flexibility is for workforce costs. So that's something that we can look into as well. I will like to mention that we were able to have a lunchtime shuttle last summer, but that was not paid with grants. That was paid through private sponsorship from the Dublin Entrepreneurial Center.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that I would say, I agree. I think we have to extend it because to your point, if we don't, I don't know that we'll be able to get back on the horse to sustain it, to get it up and running again. But I think this is a good opportunity right now that I would say that it's mining the data to find out how we can increase the use for other seniors. I think that's what I see as a big void here. I only see Avondale using it because it's being promoted by their administration because it's such a wonderful service. So how do we do that elsewhere in the city? Because there's a lot of seniors who would love this service and may not feel or know how to use it or that it's this readily available. So I'm for extending it, but I also think that we've got to really study the marketing aspect of it and the awareness by others to use it. So.
Yeah, no, Jane, you're probing an interesting point, and that's a shuttle where not the seniors or the handicapped, but other people pay to ride it. And of course, maybe if the funding from outside sources wears out, this thing evolves into that kind of thing, and we just keep it going. But that's a really good point that I think you're heading towards, possibly.
Well, I think that is, you're right. I wasn't necessarily thinking of anybody from others than seniors. I think that's a good use of a microtransit. But I think since JM said that we are limited by having seniors, but I do think that there are many more seniors that we can access. I just wonder why we haven't been able to. So I think that needs a little study if we choose to extend the contract. So we might not get riders, to Kathy's point, you can only have 2, but we might be able to help as we are in Avondale with deliveries and being a support to the senior community through microtransit.
Right.
Okay.
Councilmember Fox, real quick, there may be other opportunities as we look at the AARP grant. Some of these grants have more flexibility, I guess you could say, than other grants. So we'll continue to look for those opportunities and we'll keep you informed on how the AARP grant application goes this year. Some good feedback from our riderships have stated exactly what you've mentioned is they like to use this, and Chris touched on this as well, to see loved ones or people they care for social visits. Non-emergency medical appointments is a big ask that we're trying to work on to get that next level of evolution in the service. Just for the good of the order, we've been asked a lot about transportation to places of worship, and we're gonna have to revisit that later on because there's a lot of other sensitivities and other considerations to think about with that in particular.
Right. And also, if you do go to extend the contract, I think it's worth looking at the fact or discussing in your negotiations. One, the cost of gas has fallen in half. So the cost to run that van is cheaper, and they can't take as many people. So, I mean, I think that's all negotiable to be able to extend those grant dollars to have it last longer and longer. is certainly worth the argument, I think.
I think one of the real challenges, Jane, there's these providers like Sharon, some of these guys, they're startups too. And now because of all this happened, there's some, I can't speak to Cher because I don't know, but I think we're going to see some people come and go in this space simply because of the economics that we're dealing with here, right? And so when we say negotiations, part of this is they're going to have some minimums just to stay in business, right? And to pay their
Right.
drivers and all of that. So
Right.
I think this is just a challenging time to be doing this. So any way we, and I know you guys are doing that, and maybe you want to, I don't know if you want to bring that back to this group or what you want to do about that, but you know, in some of these partnerships, there's going to have to be mutual support, or some of these guys aren't aren't going to survive this either. So we have to think about that a little bit as much as we can, I think, in the longer term, for the longer term sake of what we all think. I think you've heard is a good program, but
Right.
it's just a tough time.
It is a tough time, but gas is not, at least at this point, is not coming out of their pocket. I mean, it's just a lesser cost to them. But yeah, I think council needs to know, in extending the contract, a clear understanding that these grant funds are what's going to feed the program, that it's not an additional amount of money. That's what I'm hearing you say, JM. It's not an additional amount of money coming out of the capital or out of the general fund, correct?
Yep.
Okay. All right, on to the fourth one, input and feedback regarding the publication of an RFP by June 1st, 2020 to select a micro transit service provider for phase 4 commencement. So let's understand what phase 4 commencement is. Would staff like to speak to that exactly, phase 4 commencement?
Yes, I can speak to that. We initially wanted to commence phase 4 this spring, but those plans had to be postponed given the circumstances. On top of that, as we had conversations with CODA and SHARE and understanding the environment these days, we understood that one, if we did want to go with an RFP, we're going to have to delay that to later in the year when there's more capacity for response. And two, when we think about, if we do think about different providers, the shares of the world, they have one way of operating and planning and implementing their microtransit service. CODA Plus, we know, will take about 6 months to implement, and that includes planning and input and other considerations. So we thought about that during this extension, that we want to have 6 months extension so people will be in better position to provide a response to our proposal. And two, if we do want to go with another provider, then we want to make sure we have plenty of time to transition and implement their service.
Okay, now does that go hand in hand with number 5, which is consolidating the existing funding for mobility projects? I mean, it seems as if you're putting out an RFP for microtransit service, would number 5, which is yeah, maybe you need to explain to us a little bit about how these two work together. Since you're postponing an RFP and then you're looking at consolidating funding for projects, for more mobility projects in the proposed spending plan in 2020, I think those kind of go hand in hand. Can you speak to that?
Yes, and with number 5 is more speaking towards the bike share implementation money that was slated for this year that is going to be postponed. We wanted to have that conversation with you all to see if we can use that funding for microtransit, because we do have to, again, front the money first before we can get reimbursed for these services. So by using some of the bike share implementation money, we'd like to use that for microtransit to make sure that we're in good standing for the next several months to a year.
Great. And so to make that clear to anyone who's listening in the committee as well, so by utilizing the bike share money to front the microtransit service that would go on until December 31st, then it would be refunded to us through the grant monies, and the money for the bike share program would be made whole again, pretty much.
The bike share money would we were not interested, I guess, in this time. We weren't thinking about putting it back in the bike share money because based on our current estimates, we probably wouldn't be able to implement that for at least 2 to 3 years of
Okay.
bike share.
Wow.
So we figured
Okay.
while we have that money in this year, why don't we use it for microtransit and revisit bike share later?
All right. Kathy, you want to speak to those 2 points? We have about 5 minutes here to finish up.
I think what I would like to see is if somebody could create a schedule and just put all this on a piece of paper. This is the money we have. This is the money we think we're going to need. Here's some of the phasing, because I'm not sure we're talking it. I'm not sure I know what we're necessarily agreeing to here in terms of I get being flexible with the dollars. Totally, I'm supportive of this. I just think it would be very helpful for us to put it on a piece of paper and say, these are the dollars we're going to move over. Here's what we think we'll be able to use from the workforce. Here's what we're not sure we're going to be able to utilize from this fund. And just put it on a one piece of paper for us so that we can nod at it and go, yeah, that's what we're nodding to. But in principle, I think that's important. And, you know, I don't know how you could go into an RFP right now, because I don't know how anybody can respond back to you right now. I don't think that they know that at this particular point. So delaying the RFP for a few months, I know it'd be great to get started, but what are you going to get, right? So to your point, moving that back just makes logical sense. So again, I'm for this. I just think it would be very helpful as we, you know, discuss it with the rest of council, to have it on a piece of paper and say, this is the dollars and cents, and these are the services we're going to deliver, and here's a time frame associated with that. Thanks.
John?
You know, I can't envision exactly where we are financially on this, and maybe it's because of the current situation that we would have to access that big a chunk of the bicycle money for 2 years. I think I would like to weigh this out, being a bicycle proponent, to see what the situation's like in a year and a half. I'd hate to just cancel it out completely and move the money back over to the other portion of the project. And I agree with Kathy. I guess on a sheet of paper, I'd have to see the monies being moved around and where the money's being utilized and what portion of it is coming in from federal funding and other sources. I guess I just can't see that right now. So I'm not sure. I think I need to see the dollars to make a fair judgment on this.
Thanks, John. I'll just wrap it up here too. I agree with John and Kathy. I'm not seeing the entire financial picture. I understand that the bike money is probably not going to get used right away, but there might be other uses for it, and wayfinding is important in the way of bikes. So whether or not that needs to be funded. I think that that because of this situation, allowing us to have some time to really know what those numbers look like, and understanding how this program is going to actually have some steps to collect the data, advertise to maybe a few more people, that sort of thing. I think there's some marketing time, there's some evaluation of the objectives if we do move forward with it. So I think we need more numbers, I agree, and a little bit more data about the people and the use of it. So I hope that helps staff, give you some insight on where we're going. Anybody else have any other comments before we close?
I guess this is sort of an off-the-cuff crazy comment, but can our program be named something differently? Go Dublin, Travel Dublin, or is it always tied to one of these companies? And I don't know if anybody else is doing it any way differently. I presume not, because the contract's with the company. Is that correct?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, that is correct. But we could always look at general branding for the service. It could be, you know, Dublin Shuttle powered by X or something.
Right.
Devyani, just one last comment, because this was pilot program. getting commitment from companies was a little bit challenge for us. Companies were not sure if we were going to continue. So that's where our struggle was when we were talking to companies, and also branding of these vehicles. We tried the magnetic boards to attach with Dublin on the vans, but again, since it was pilot program with certain end date, it was a little bit challenging with marketing and engaging with our community.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. I think the share program doesn't speak to what it really is. And I think that will go a long way to helping others use it more. So I totally agree with that. All right, we have to end at 4:45. So thank you all. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.